Next in line is David Skaggs, who was in Congress from 1987 to 1999, representing the Boulder District, soon to be represented by independent Nick Thomas, who's here somewhere. He's a Marine veteran, and he is also in the Reform Caucus. And as I said, Zach Wamp is he's a Republican. He was in the House of Representatives from 1995 to 2011 from the Chattanooga area. He ran for governor, didn't make it. And his most famous line is that in his first 6 years in Congress, it was all about policy and principle, and his second half of was all about money, politics, negativity, and power. Those were the Tom DeLay years when they blew the budget open. Anyway, so first question, briefly, why are you here? Why did you come to this thing?
Wasn't that Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate?
Yes. Who am I and what am I doing here?
Once you run for office with great ideology and passion for the country, and all three of us still share that. We're still very, very actively engaged. But everyone knows that the system's not working functionally and that we have huge challenges. $23 trillion of debt, climate change, a dysfunctional organization, a declining global standing. And we've got to try to reform it. I will just thank you all for being here. It's so great to see you, people who are passionate about their country enough to take a weekend and fly across the country. A lot of young people here, relative to the Democrat. I don't know about you, Zach, but when I go to the Democratic Party functions, there are people make me look like a whippersnapper. I mean, so it's great to see all these young people who still believe in America and want to change it. So that's the deal. You either are in the fight and trying to make it better, or you give up and the country and the world goes to hell.
Okay, David?
Well, welcome to Colorado. It's great to have you all here. I'm here as a Democrat, and I don't want to pretend otherwise, but as a Democrat that feels the middle of our political life has been so hollowed out that solutions are almost impossible to imagine to the tough issues that are facing us, some of which Brian ticked off. So while I remain a Democrat, I want to see the center repopulated. And I think independent candidates have a great leverage opportunity, whether they win or merely are a voice to get the two sides to talk to each other.
Zach?
I would maybe just smile and say I'm attracted to courage and disruption. That's why I'm here. But actually, I was sort of a change agent when I served, and believe that neither party has an exclusive on integrity or ideas. And as I said on Morning Joe in February, I think the two-party system served our country well for about 80 years, and it has not served our country well for the last 20 years. And I think that we need competition. And I'm here because I'm looking for young Americans that are willing to step in the gap and step up. And I'm asking guys my age to help them and then get out of the way, because I believe that young Americans are the only ones that can actually change what we see today.
Okay, so why are you still Democrats and Republicans in view of the fact that the duopoly is trying to freeze out independence? And as Michael Porter and Catherine Gale wrote in the best article I've ever read about what's wrong with American politics, the two parties serve themselves and their donors and their interest groups very well. They serve the American people hardly at all. So why do you stick with your parties? Brian?
Well, if you asked Nancy Pelosi that, she'd ask me the same about me. Why are you still a Democrat? Believe me. The thing is, for me, is it's not about just disavowing one party or another. If we just say the whole goal is to just have an I instead of a D or an R, we've lost the purpose. The goal for me is to get the country back on track. And so I think we have to work with moderate centrist Republicans, moderate centrist independents, and moderate centrist Democrats. And so I will support people on both sides of the aisle and independents in order to get this thing moving forward.
David?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mort. I look, just for comparison, at a country like Japan, which has a party structure that doesn't stand for anything other than staying in power, or getting power. I still believe that parties play an important role in framing the important issue, or should, in framing the important issues that face the country and providing an organizing principle that tell voters, you know, if we vote for these guys, we can expect this. If we vote for those guys, we can expect that. That has been largely missing in action lately, but I don't want to disavow the important role that parties can play in helping voters understand how they have choices about where the country is headed. These parties today aren't doing that very well, but I still think parties have that important role to play.
So by definition, Mort, I am the national co-chairman of the Reformers Caucus of Issue 1. That's 201 former members of Congress, governors, and cabinet secretaries united around a couple of dozen reforms, most of which Unite actually supports, the entire independent movement supports. And if I'm the Republican co-chairman, then I need to be a Republican, number one. I mean, that's kind of logical. The second thing, though, is that some of this is sort of regional. I'm from Tennessee. I'm from a very red state. Pragmatically, I think I can do more good right now trying to move Republicans into an independent place and challenge newer Republicans to have the guts to be independent and to stand up. So if you come from a red state, I mean, we're not going to overnight turn these things around. So what happens between here and there? You know, I said on Morning Joe, if we had 12 independents elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, they could swing the balance of power. Matter of fact, I have this vision that is 217 on November the 8th, and Nick Thomas just got elected as an independent from Colorado, and he is the most influential person in the new Congress on who's going to be Speaker. What about the rules package? That's the kind of thing I think we need in this country. But I'm a Republican who just said that.
Okay, so how do you account for the increasing polarization of American politics? Is it the fault of the politicians and the parties, or is it the fault of the people? Because increasingly, the people identify with the parties, and the war is, you know, Democrats are starting to hate Republicans just because they're Republicans, and vice versa. How did all this start, and what can be done to fix it?
Well, how much time do we have, Mort?
Yeah, not a lot.
Let me
but,
pick.
but
Let me pick on
feel free.
a couple of things. One of which is familiar to everybody, and one of which I think is probably pretty obscure. And you know, Mark Gerzon is here. He and I worked with party folks from both parties in the House to put the bipartisan retreats together back in the late 90s and early aughts. And the fundamental idea there was that members of Congress spend no time with each other getting to know each other as people, realizing they have shared human stories, and that they ought to be able to work things out, but they don't spend enough time together to develop the trust that is essential to the compromise that is the basic material of the legislative process. So that's one thing. And an aggravating factor there is that as American society has changed over the last couple of generations, most newly elected members of Congress now do not bring their families to Washington. Don't get written about much in the political science literature, but it is hugely important to look back at what an effect that had on moderating the behavior of members of Congress. When I moved back there, newly elected and newly married in '86 with kids and a wife, and just think about how important it is for these men and women to go home at night to families that don't think they're very important. Take out the garbage, cut the grass, normalizing kinds of things. And I was on appropriations back in the day with Bob Livingston. My wife and Bob's wife were good friends. I knew if I got on Bob's case in the Appropriations Committee, Laura would hear from Bonnie, and I would hear from Laura, and that's not a good thing.
Zach? How do you...
Well, unless and until this rigged system is blown up, blame is actually a weapon. And it's been weaponized to, if you can't get the job done, just blame the other team. And blame has become a real weapon. And as we've become so polarized in deep red and deep blue districts through gerrymandering and many other things, money, big influence of money, blame becomes a political strategy. And frankly, that's not to me, that's only about a 20-year deal. That didn't happen that much 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. It's become the number one thing. That leads to the polarization. There are people who go to Congress now in both parties. This is the best job they'll ever have in their life. And they're so glad to be there, they're willing to hunker down in the bosom of their party and follow whatever the leader says to stay there, and they surround each other and protect each other, and that's a rigged damn system, and we need to blow it up.
Well, it's also, we're all friends with Charlie Johnson, the former parliamentarian, and you ask yourself, if you watch C-SPAN, which many of you do, it's fun to be in a crowd where people do, but there used to be real debate. The advent of television and the strategy of using the television just for prepared speeches and messaging remarks, the numbers of time you'll actually see somebody on C-SPAN say to a member of the other party, that's a really good point. Maybe we should accept the gentlelady's debate and modify the bill. You almost never see it. You almost never see that anybody paid attention. So and then you add to that the biased media. I don't mean the mainstream media, which I really infinitely respect, but the Fox News and to some extent MSNBC, where you're just hearing what you want to hear, and they're picking people from the extremes. If you have a reputation as a moderate, it's pretty rare you're going to get on a talk show. They don't want to hear you. The base doesn't want to hear you. I took a tough position on the Iraq War and mid-war, and a guy who'd always had me on his progressive radio show said, I don't want you on. I don't want you to tell your perspective and why you took these votes. So that they're playing to their base.
Hey, without belaboring, let me just add something, because Joel talked this morning, Ron and others and Mort, about the media playing a role in change. The media, you talk about a talk show, there really is not enough journalism anymore. It's all ratings-driven division. And that's why you don't get on. And that's where this change also has to be embraced by these other advocates, these influencers that Joel was talking about earlier today, curators, I think he called them.
Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of Zach's intervention again, because you asked, is this all the politicians' fault, or do the people have some responsibility? And I want to take that on, because I think part of this, reminds you of the old Pogo cartoon on First Earth Day. We've met the enemy, and it is us. And the us here is the almost total neglect of civic education in the K-12 educational system of the country. John Dewey said democracy has to be born anew for each generation, and education is its midwife. This is a complicated system. It depends on compromise, and if we don't have a electorate that understands that the business of our politics has to be compromised, they are easy prey for the divisiveness that has taken over.
Yeah, I hope all of you who get elected will start repairing American K-12 education immediately as soon as you get into office, and civics education being a big part of it. Okay.
Let me give one last point on that. We must be very, very careful in this movement to not replicate the sins of the other side. If Mort's question was, how do we account for the divisiveness and the polarization between the D's and the R's, if we seek to gain power by saying a plague on both their houses but not on us, we are part of the problem, and we're manifesting the same divisiveness, the same lack of substance, the same power-motivated partisanship, and the same lack of intellectual integrity as we're seeing on the other side.
Well, just to challenge, have you heard anything here? I mean, there is a tendency among independents to say the two parties are corrupt and to frame them as the enemy. As a matter of fact, somebody came up with that question this morning. So you're suggesting that we not look for enemies?
No, well, yeah, I am, in fact. Well, I think we need to look for enemies in manipulating our electoral system in Russia. But I think here in this group, what we need to say is there are good people on both sides of the aisle who care about America, and we want to work with them. And that doesn't mean for a second that if we all got elected and it was all independents, the whole place is going to work, because that's just not real. And I think we have to be honest and say our agenda has to be deeper than just saying the system's broke, throw everybody else out.
Okay, so Congress clearly does not work to solve any problem except on a totally partisan basis when it solves the problem at all. And it doesn't solve immigration, it doesn't solve infrastructure, it doesn't solve the deficit, God knows. So what 3 or 4 things does it take to fix it, to make Congress work for the American people?
One thing is crisis. I hate to say this, but like, I'm a Republican, and Republicans have so lost any focus on the debt and the deficit for this next generation that it's going to take a hell of a crisis worse than '08 for that to ever be a priority again, because it's just not going to be. So crisis is one thing that has to happen, unfortunately, to get sweeping reaction from the American electorate in the meantime. But I also believe in incremental change. I believe that the more of Nick Thomases that get elected, the more will follow, an incremental change. And frankly, the American people, we know now for 5 years, why are 44% of the people identifying as independents? Because the two parties are complete. I mean, I can sit and define why. Number one, there is no Republican Party. This is the party of Donald Trump. Democrats is just a fragmented party of special interest groups. And at this pace, neither one of them are ever going to come back into a major role of leading the country to a better place. So independents, and I'm talking about independents within those parties, are going to have to step up, and independents outside of those two parties as they can get elected. I'm just a realist. I think it's still 6 to 8 years before we really see a significant number of independents elected because of money.
But as you know, the system, the congressional system and the political system is rigged to keep the leaders of both parties in charge of everything. So if you were going to fix Congress so that there was real debate, for example, there was compromise, how would you go about doing it?
Brian, how about a speaker that's neither Republican or Democrat? I'll give that one to you.
Zach and I have been talking about this. This is something I've been working on for years. The Constitution it simply says the House shall choose its own speaker. Does it? And remember, Washington, when he presided over the Constitutional Convention, was not a partisan speaker or president of that convention. And in fact, he cautioned against the despotism of factionalism. So it is possible, for example, to have an independent speaker or at least somebody elected with bipartisan votes. We could have a crazy common sense reform like 72 hours to read legislation, and you can't violate it unless you have 3/4 vote to violate it. We could have regular order where bills have to come through a committee before they come through the House of Representatives or the Senate. So basic reforms like that, and that should be part of our platform. And that's surely what the Reformers Caucus is working on. And frankly, Zach's leading that, and David Skaggs, when he was in the Congress, was a champion and a real reformer of that kind of stuff.
No simple answers, Mort, not that you were expecting any. Let me just throw out one weird idea that would be able to be done next January. And that is the House, through its rulemaking, and the Senate, through its rulemaking at the beginning of each Congress, could attack the money in politics problem. The House could pass a rule saying no member shall be seated in this House who maintains what's called a leadership PAC, a huge distraction from the business of the Congress. And by rule, you could do things that you couldn't do by legislation without bumping up against the First Amendment and Citizens United. But each body is the manager of its own rules and the qualifications of its members. So across the land, if you wanted to go out and as independent candidates, for example, at candidate forums say, will you support a rules change next January that outlaws leadership PACs? They are a hugely corrupting bit of what goes on in Washington these days. They are basically slush funds for sitting members to spend on whatever they wish.
And to buy votes for their leadership.
Right.
Can I define that for a minute? Because Issue
sure.
1 just finished a lot of research on leadership PACs because they really didn't exist. I never had one because when I got to Congress, they almost did not exist at all. Now every senator has one, and like 75% of the House members have one.
400 and some out of 535.
And so listen at this, y'all. Two members in the last 10 years have gone to jail for using their federal campaign fund for personal use. Both of those candidates, had they done the exact same thing they went to jail for and used a leadership PAC, they would have had no legal jeopardy whatsoever because there's no personal use language in the creation of a leadership PAC. So you can take all your buddies from high school to Bandon Dunes for a weekend for $25,000 out of a leadership PAC, and it's legal. And so, number one, you need to do away with them, but the minimum you should do is make sure that they have the exact same requirements in them that a regular federal account has.
the lawyer in me has to intervene. It's not quite the case that you can use them for anything you want, but it's close.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
Nobody really monitors your use.
The
So,
Office of Congressional
honestly,
Ethics does.
so honestly, having covered Congress and watched its comity and ability to compromise and get things done deteriorate by the year, I mean, you have an uphill climb here. Nancy Pelosi is not going to do what you want to do.
I call her, she will.
Yeah, right. So, and whoever replaces Paul Ryan is not going to do it. So how are you going to get it done? That's how are you going to get it done?
One thing I want to say now, I said about young candidates. I'm convinced that we need a generational shift in leadership if you want change to last. I just really believe that this next generation is going to have to step into dramatic leadership, because you can't teach an old dog new tricks. These people that are there, you can run them out kind of slowly, and frankly, a whole lot of Republicans are leaving because of what happened in 16 and the fact that they just feel like uncomfortable all the time, and they have to raise money all the time, and they're hamstrung on a wheel, and that gets rid of some of them, but who replaces them? I honestly believe that the next generation is more pragmatic, they're more open, they're more cooperative, they're not stuck in their rut. And I'm ashamed of this. I'm a baby boomer, but this baby boomers, we're the first generation in American history that's left the country in worse shape than we found it. We're too ideological. We're stuck in our ditches. We will not change. And that's why you're so blue or so red. We need a new generation that's pragmatic, that's going to save the country, working together. Let's help get them elected. A lot of them will be independent. Some of them will still be in the two-party system. That is change, and that needs to happen sooner rather than later. That's a permanent change, not a temporary change.
Okay, so okay, we got a question over here.
John Brackney, been involved in politics for 30 years professionally from Colorado, three-time former elected Republican, now unaffiliated. I'm optimistic about your presentation today and also everybody in the room, but I have two major concerns, and I throw them out for your reflection. One, the Stanford study that says unaffiliated people are actually crazier than Republicans or Democrats. They're actually not Republicans or Democrats, they are actually more extreme.
That's a high bar.
Yeah, fair enough. And the second is just the laziness of the American voter, unfortunately, and the high percentage of people that just go right down Republican or right down Democrat. If you can give us some guidance, we'd appreciate it.
That gets back to the civics piece. I mean, really, the whole education of how this system works, you have to know that. You have to know how precious it is. You have to know how easily it's lost. And the average citizen doesn't know it. They're interested in tomorrow's pro football game. They're interested in whatever their family's doing. They actually have checked out now in droves of American politics because the two-party system has let us down. Our leadership has let them down so bad that a whole generation of Americans thinks it's a bad reality TV show. This is Jerry Springer. I don't want to have anything to do with it. We've got to change that fundamentally. It begins with education.
Well, and I would say it doesn't just mean that the politicians and the parties are the culprits. Right. It is all of us who have neglected our civic responsibilities, and we have neglected them because we don't know we have them, because we haven't educated our people that this is a system that depends upon good journalism, on paying attention, on staying involved, on voting, and life is really busy with all sorts of other things. If you don't have that instilled in you from K through 12, you're probably going to neglect it as an adult.
I'd say just two things. One, I started a group last year. We wanted every politician to be on either side or independent to be asked 3 questions, and the questions were, what will you do? And here's the key point. And what will you ask us to do to solve climate change, the deficit, and political dysfunction? And the point is, we never ask the voters to do something. John Kennedy did, about the last guy who did. We don't ask them to adjust their lifestyle to deal with the federal deficit or to adjust their lifestyle to deal with climate change. And we got to start. We got to tell people we're just as good as you are. We're no better. We're no worse. And we got to do that. The other thing is I'm a huge fan of ranked choice voting, and I think that would start to change some of this.
Sure.
Okay, I think we got time for one more.
What a perfect segue.
Yeah, one more.
So,
What? We got one over there.
sorry, so I'm Marty Groman, independent running for Congress in Maine CD1 with ranked choice voting, and which is great. But one of the things that's really been great about this conference is just messaging, and for me, you know, thinking about how to talk about who are you going to caucus with and questions you get all the time. And one of the things that I say about the parties is, look, I don't have a problem with either party. I think they're both great. It's the two of them together that's the problem. And we need to break that up by sending more independents to Washington.
Okay.
Well, one thing I want to say to him is Angus King's a really, really close personal friend of mine, and he tells me that the only reason that he caucuses with the Democrats in the Senate is so he'll have a committee assignment. And when you get elected as an independent from Maine in U.S. House, and when you get elected as an independent from Colorado, for God's sakes, insist that you get committee assignments and you get treated like a citizen elected to Congress and not a party member elected to Congress, because that, I think, is unconstitutional, that you have to affiliate with a political party in order to be properly seated with committee assignments, right?
Okay, we got to leave a little time for, yes, sir. You seem to be urgent. Go ahead.
Twice today I've heard people talk about taking pledges. And I think back with Grover Cleveland and his no tax pledge.
Grover Norquist.
Norquist, sorry.
Yeah.
Grover, sorry. How effective or how wise do you think it is for us as independents to be taking pledges towards our party? Is it any more wise than it was for Republicans to do it with Grover's pledge? It just doesn't
Well, there's a
seem
big
wise
difference.
to lock yourself down if you're trying to serve the people in general.
There's a big difference between taking a pledge to under no circumstances ever raise any revenue when you got a $23 trillion debt, or saying, I pledge that I will support a rules package that gives me time to read the legislation. I think we can manage that subtlety. And that's what we're asking is, and the real pledge we're saying is, be open to a more productive rules package. We're not necessarily saying item by item.
But one thing I wanted to point out is Grover Norquist's pledge caused a whole lot of my colleagues to, no matter what, follow down that path. So the hammer of, we expect you to do certain things if we elect you, should still be out there, in my opinion. You have to have reform-minded people go and reform. Otherwise, they just fall right in line with everybody else, and then you think, what in the world happened? We want people to be reformers, no matter which party they run from, and we're going to basically say, if you're not, we want to hold you accountable. He actually did that. I don't like what he did, but he did that. You know, my son, when he ran for Congress and almost got elected with some of you young guys, he refused to sign that pledge. It hurt him. It hurt him. So it does actually work, and the reform movement to get people to do stuff, we got to have commitments from them, I think, and then we got to hold them accountable.
I think the commitments need to be about process, not about individual segments of public policy like the Norquist Pledge. So a pledge about reform is one thing, not about taxes is another. And the reason we are susceptible to those pledges gets back to civic education. If you have a population that thinks this is all simple stuff and a pledge will do the trick, politicians will take a pledge.
We got to quit. Thank you very much.
Thank
you
y'all.
guys are great. Thank you.